Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us at this World Wildlife Fund Forest and Climate Initiative online learning session. My name is Breen Burns, and I will be your facilitator. Our topic today is ensuring social safeguards in REDD+, and our speaker is Minnie Degawan. Minnie is the WWF Forest and Climate Initiative's advisor on social safeguards based in the Philippines. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly go over a few things. First, please make sure your microphone, which is the green icon next to your name, is muted to help reduce background noise. Second, please use and watch your chat window. You can use this feature during the presentation to contact me if you're having technical difficulties. And finally, please hold your questions until the end of the session. You should submit questions through the question panel, and I'll read them aloud to our presenter at the appropriate time. Thank you again for joining us, and with that, I'll turn it over to Minnie.
Hi, good evening. My name is Minnie Degawan. I am an indigenous Kankanae from the Cordillera of the Philippines, and I am working as a social safeguards advisor for the Forest and Climate Initiative of WWF. Prior to that, I was working with the International Alliance of Indigenous and Tribal Peoples of the Tropical Forests, where I was their project coordinator for a project on ensuring that the indigenous people's capacity is built so that they can participate in the negotiations of the CBD. And I have also been doing a lot of community trainings on FPIC, and I have the last thing I did before joining WWF was to coordinate case studies on how FPIC was conducted in several countries, and it has been a very interesting study. And so thank you for joining us tonight on REDD and social safeguards, and we have the following topics that are to be discussed for this learning session. A short description on what are safeguards and standards, and what is free prior informed consent, and why do safeguards matter, and then a description of REDD+ related challenges for indigenous peoples and local communities. And then I'll just present two case studies from Philippines and Vietnam on how FPIC has been conducted in their territories. And then we can have a short discussion on moving from words to action, or the implementation of social safeguards. And then we can have an open discussion. So once again, thank you for joining us. So next slide, please, please. Just to reiterate the vision of WWF for REDD+, and that is really hoping that REDD+ will contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore abating climate change, but at the same time maintaining biodiversity, and to contribute to sustainable and equitable development through the strengthening of livelihoods of local communities, and recognizing and respecting indigenous people's rights. So this is what WWF FCI hopes REDD+ will accomplish. And in accomplishing that vision, we hope that safeguards will also be recognized. So next slide, please, Brit. Okay, so what are safeguards and standards? Safeguards are actions or mechanisms aimed to minimize or mitigate adverse impacts of REDD+ to a specific group, in this case, the indigenous and local communities. And usually safeguards are looking at abetting the negative impacts, but it should also include positive results. So it should go beyond the do no harm to do good. On the other hand, standards include defined and measurable levels of performance that can be achieved, and standards can be voluntary or mandatory and can include safeguards. So safeguards actually come from standards which are universal or are general principles. And then based on the local context, safeguards are to be developed. And I think it's important to stress that safeguards are not static, but they must be contextualized to the local situation and must be determined and implemented locally. Next slide, please. As you might have observed, there's a trend to ensure that safeguards and standards are in place in REDD Plus activities, and this is really a recognition that primarily REDD Plus has positive benefits, but at the same time there are potential negative impacts, and that is why it is necessary to have safeguards in place so that these negative impacts will be minimized. It is also a recognition that indigenous peoples have lived in and used the forest for generations, and that they have accumulated knowledge that is very essential in ensuring sustainable forest management. And that knowledge has to be utilized and shared by all. And the other thing is that indigenous peoples and local communities are dependent on forests, and if their needs are not taken into account, then there is a danger that the project will not prosper, because the people who are dependent on those forests will, of course, not give their permission for such activities. But primarily, safeguards and standards in this context is a recognition that indigenous peoples have rights. And I would like to stress that it is in fact the sustained advocacy work by indigenous peoples that brought about this awareness for the need for safeguards. And it is important that people have ownership, or that sense of being part of a project to ensure its viability. So these are the reasons why safeguards and standards are important. So next slide, please. What is free, prior, informed consent? It is the most repeated safeguard. I think in most of the multilateral development cooperation activities, and even ODAs have a mention of FPIC. But what is FPIC? FPIC is a right and a process. That's why it is both a safeguard and at the same time a right. It is a right to a process, and it arises from the recognition that indigenous peoples have rights over their territories, and that right includes the right to self-determination, which essentially means that they have the right to determine what kind of development or what kind of activity will happen in their territories. It is place and people specific. Meaning it is the people in a specific community who have that collective right. And it is a collective right, and it is different from the individual right of consent. So it is exercised by a people based on their traditional decision-making processes. So that is the context of FPIC. And the objective of FPIC is to enable indigenous peoples to become equal participants in any negotiations. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, FPIC is a process. It is a process of empowerment to ensure that the communities are able to negotiate with others on equal footing. And because it is a process, there is no predetermined outcome of the process. The process can lead to acceptance of a project, or it can lead to the amendment of a project, or it can lead to the rejection of a project. Often indigenous peoples would say that there is something wrong with the term FPIC, because it automatically means that it is consent that is being given. But the whole right is that it is a process, and therefore, while it says free, prior, informed consent, it should not be taken that the end view of the process is to get a consent. And it arises from the collective identity of the community. So again, it is very important to stress this, because often what development agencies would do is to get the consent of representatives or of organizations, forgetting that it is the community, it is place-based, that has to make the decision. The consultation process can be done with representatives, but ultimately the right to withhold or give consent should be the community. And again, because it is a process, it cannot be a rigid process, so it cannot be boxed into a checklist. So you cannot say that, okay, we did FPIC and we have this checklist and we check the participation of youth, the participation of women, and we have talked to the elders, therefore FPIC in this community has been done. FPIC is a very dynamic process, so there can be no one-size-fits-all process. Next slide, please. So it's important to remember that FPIC is part of the safeguards. And why do safeguards matter? Again, it confirms ownership by the communities of the project, which will ensure that the project will be sustained. It minimizes risks and conflicts, and I think more importantly, it grounds our activities to people's needs. When we say that a project is owned by the community, then we are sure that that community will ensure the sustainability of that project. For instance, if the project sees, or if the community looks at a project as something that is being imposed from above, then they will not cooperate. Or if they do cooperate, they will only cooperate to a certain level if they are being given benefits. But once the payments are done, then they will abandon the project. Whereas if the community feels that that project is theirs, then they will sustain it. So that's why it's very important that safeguards are in place before actual activities take place. Next slide, please. Again, as I said, because safeguards is also needing to be localized, there cannot be just common safeguards for indigenous peoples and local communities, but there are certain elements, or there are common elements that are affecting indigenous peoples. And I think the primary issue is the issue of land and resource rights. I think all over the world, indigenous peoples face the same concern and the same issue, that their land and resource rights is either not recognized or it's being violated. And in fact, this is the driving force for indigenous peoples to engage in REDD+, is the possibility that their land and resource rights will be recognized or protected. And so this securing land and resource rights may include delineation or mapping of indigenous territories and legal recognition of such as indigenous territories distinct from public lands. This is a common demand by indigenous peoples, that they want to delineate their indigenous territories and separate it from the public domain. So this is really common demand. And there is also the possibility of receiving legal recognition, such as titling of such lands in the name of indigenous peoples. But this is problematic if indigenous peoples do not have the capacity to defend or even understand what is titling, because in some situations, the elite of the indigenous communities were able to obtain legal titles over vast lands to the detriment of the other community members. So if titling is to be done, then it should be done with the consent of the whole community. And then it's also important that resource rights are not limited to land, but also the resources contained therein, like forest products and the water, because this is especially true now that water is becoming a big issue for many indigenous people. So when people, indigenous peoples say that they want their land rights recognized, it actually includes also their resource rights. Next slide, please. And then the second one is effective participation at in all project levels. This is also one of those common safeguards that we see in many policy papers. All talk about effective participation, but what is effective participation? If there is no built-in mechanism to ensure that the participation is not just window dressing, or that indigenous peoples and local communities do not end up being mere audience in meetings. So it is important that capacity building is included in project activities to ensure that representatives will be able to effectively articulate the concerns of the community. And this is where sometimes some development agencies fail, because they think that, oh, but we tried to talk to them and they don't want to talk to us. And we did consultation. But sometimes even the language or the manner of discussions, you also have to build the capacity of the community leaders to be able to participate in discussions. And there should also be recognition that the communities can designate their representatives. And when they do this, that there is also a clear process for reporting back. Sometimes, again, project proponents would be happy to say that, okay, you have your representatives, and then they just talk to the representatives, but there is also a need to ensure that there's a reporting back process. And then the last two is the participation of all groups must be ensured, but at the same time make sure that there is no, we don't develop false participation. For instance, we want women to participate in the discussions. And the way we do that is either to form women's groups or women's committees, or have a women's caucus. And this might, in some instances, be false participation, because you may have the women sitting in the hall where the discussions are being made, but that is not their usual place, and perhaps they make their decisions in other places, and then they bring that decision to the community hall in a different way. So what is important is to recognize that communities have defined ways to arrive at decisions, and it is important to recognize and respect that. Next slide, please. Okay, the issue of benefit sharing. More and more, this is becoming a source of internal conflict for indigenous peoples and local communities, especially when cash benefits are being offered as the first option. So there has to be a mechanism to ensure that equitable sharing should be in place. But even before they talk about equitable sharing, there has to be a full discussion in the community of what the needs of the community are and what can be the benefits for participating in such activities. And care should be taken not to offer cash incentives or payments as the first option. The community has to define by themselves what are the benefits. And another important aspect of benefit sharing is knowing who the actual beneficiaries are, because sometimes in project activities, the regional community might expand in size, and there are migrants coming in, and then because they're more articulate and they demand benefit sharing and to the detriment of the original community members. So it is very important that at the start of the project that there is a defined census on who the potential beneficiaries are. So yeah, next slide please. Okay, so we go to the case studies, the interesting case studies. We conducted a case study on how FPIC has been implemented in several communities over the last 10 years after, as you know, the Philippines has a law on indigenous people's rights, and it has a very defined mechanism on FPIC. It also has defined what are the activities where FPIC is necessary. And in most of the cases that we studied, most of the projects involved are extractive in nature, mining. And one of the things that is coming out is that there's just too much legislation. It is too rigid because every step of the process is legislated, or there's a guideline to be followed, and there is a checklist to be checked. And this makes it very, what do you call it? It's not dynamic. So it becomes very rigid. And when indigenous peoples want to do it their way, then it cannot be done because it is against the law. So there is just too much legislation. With regards to checklist syndrome, like I said earlier, it says that they have to consult with the youth, with the women, and to be able to show to the proponents that they have done that, they are organizing women's groups, youth groups, and some communities have expressed that this is actually dividing the community because internally they have already made a decision. But the biggest problem really is that the government agency, which is the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, which is tasked to oversee the FPIC process, has been acting as a facilitator of the process, and all their expenses are being paid for by the company. So neutrality is actually risked, and the communities are asking whether the facilitators are actually standing for the rights of indigenous peoples, or they are acting as company spokespersons. And sometimes good faith can go wrong. This is interesting really in the context of the Philippines because, of course, when you invite people to a meeting, then it goes on for the whole day. You are expected to feed them. And so they are fed, but also culturally, if you partake of the meal offered by your host, then you have a debt of gratitude to that host. So sometimes indigenous peoples find it very difficult to say no to a project because they have been fed, and even the process of the consultation is that they bring them to outside of the communities to 5-star hotels in the capital, so they're awed and they feel that they cannot speak out. But of course, talking with some of the companies, they would say it was really done on good faith. We just wanted to show them also a different world, but that builds up a different feeling for some of the communities. So it is important to always be culturally sensitive so that the process does not run the risk of being hijacked. So the lesson learned here is that FPIC process should be iterative and not too rigid and not just to follow a checklist. There are, of course, in the case of the Philippines, the FPIC, despite having a very good law and even a very good guideline on FPIC, there are questions on whether the decisions being reached are actually free because they are being coerced with soft coercion. They're being promised benefits of roads, schools, employment for the community members, and in some instances, hard they are being pressured by the presence of armed military personnel. So the question of whether it is free is still a question. So that is for the Philippines, and then the next case is the case of Vietnam. Next slide, please. Which is the UN REDD pilot project on FP. And they presented this at the regional workshop on FP. And the process was that they tried to conduct an FPIC process in a defined community. And it is very positive in the sense that it brought the issue of FPIC to the attention of the government. I mean, Vietnam is also very centralized government system, but with the UN REDD project, they were able to go beyond this central government system and go to the communities. So this is the positive thing that came out of that process, is that both government and communities were able to engage in the process of process. However, and I think this is because of the situation in Vietnam where there is not a very strong indigenous movement, so they use non-indigenous facilitators. So there were problems of language, problems of process, and also very unclear questions. And there was also rigidity in the process of arriving at a decision. The people were asked to vote, and not only that, the questions asked was unclear. When we were asking what was the question, there were differing opinions. Some said that the question that was asked was, would you like to go home now? And there were others who said that the question was whether we wanted to conserve our forests, because the UN REDD was saying it was a successful FPIC process because they achieved 100% conformity to the decision of yes. But when we dig deeper into it, there was the question that was asked was not very clear, and it wasn't even related to REDD. Well, probably conserving the forest is a REDD type of question, but really, what member of the community would say no to such a question? So the lesson learned here is the need to build the capacity of communities to understand the issues being presented, the issues that they're being asked to decide on, and more importantly, in the case of Vietnam, they need to build their capacity to understand that it is their right to be consulted, and it's not as if it is an imposition from the government that we have to go through this and you have to come up with a decision, but rather they have to see it as their right. So it is important in both cases that capacity building of the affected communities is built into the process of FP. And that capacity building can take on several months, and also a long process, especially in very complex issues such as REDD+. So there is really no shortcut with regards to FP. So next slide, please. Okay. So how do we then make sure that our safeguards are actually implemented and not remain on paper? Because more and more we see very, very good safeguards on paper, but how are these actually being implemented? And I think it would be good to look at the paper of the WWF on Indigenous Peoples and Conservation Statement on Principles by WWF, because it actually has enumerated the principles of partnership, which is really an in-depth analysis of the situation based on field investigation, including also a study on the legal rights and legal situation of the affected communities. So I think it is important that at the start of the, if we want to work in a specific area, that we do this grounded investigation. And then we have to consult, which is to have dialogues with diverse community members. And it is very important that when we do dialogues and consultations, that we do not limit ourselves to selected few or only to those who are able to speak our language or who are able to talk to us. But I think it's even more important to reach out to those who are not able to converse with us. And there's a need to build trust building, and really trust building is achieved not by just coming in and taking off. So there has also be time to interact with the community at their own pace, and the need to for continuous interaction. It's not enough that, okay, we have stayed with you for 2 months and we know your situation, we have achieved this partnership, you have signed on to a MOA or with an understanding. But I think it is also important that we continue interacting with the community in their territory to ensure that we have updated information, and also to ensure that the dialogue continues. And I think the other important aspect of safeguards is the need for grievance mechanisms that are accessible to communities, and that the communities know about this, and that they are able to use a grievance mechanism that has been arrived at with them. And it is also important that such a grievance mechanism should act on reports of violations in a timely manner. So these are the some of the basic principles to ensure that safeguards are actually implemented and that they get out from paper into concrete actions. Next slide, please. So essentially what I'm saying is that safeguards, including FPIC, to ensure that they are actually implemented, it's not easy. It's not going to be done shortly, but it is a very complex process. There are no shortcuts to it, and it might even be expensive, and it is time-consuming. But if we don't engage with them, it is even more risky. So we should undertake REDD+ activities, not just with a focus on carbon, but also to improve people's lives, which is what the WWF mission is all about. So ensuring that safeguards are implemented ensures that we achieve the mission that we have set out to do. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Minnie. That was a great presentation. And at this point, we will open up the floor to questions. So please feel free to submit questions using your panel, and I will read them aloud to Minnie. And to get us started, our first question for Minnie is FPIC the same as effective consultation?
No. And this is the main objection actually to the World Bank safeguard, which has said that it is now effective consultation and not FPIC, because FPIC denotes the right to say no, whereas consultation is really just you're being asked your opinion, and the project proponent may or may not take your opinion on board, whereas FPIC clearly denotes the right to say no to a certain project.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, can FPIC be the super safeguard? Is it enough to have just FPIC, and will it cover the rest of the concerns of IPLCs?
Yes, there are some who would say that FPIC, if FPIC is implemented properly, then it should cover all the other concerns, but it does not actually address. It might get some recognition of land rights and resource rights, but it is not. It's not enough. So FPIC is, again, as I said, both a safeguard and a right. Therefore, it cannot be just, it cannot be the super safeguard and just say, we've done FPIC, then we have fulfilled our safeguard obligations. Because ensuring that the rights to lands and resources is, I think, another step forward after FPIC is done properly.
Great, thank you. So the next question and comment says, Minnie mentioned a cross-country study she did on FPIC in various countries prior to her time with WWF. What is the name of that publication, and is it accessible anywhere?
Yes, it should be accessible at the www.international-alliance.org website. It is, but it is a staggered publication. So the first publication was on Nepal, Costa Rica, and Kenya. And then the third one was Philippines, Malaysia, and Tanzania. So yes, it should be available in the internationalalliance.org website.
Thank you. So the next question is, do you have examples of FPIC or consultation about REDD policy designing? Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, the case in Vietnam was actually specifically for REDD Plus activities. And it was actually, conducted by UN REDD as a preparatory activity, and well, they also wanted to pilot FPIC. Other than that, I have not heard of others, but I'm sure that there are other REDD Plus activities that have undertaken FPIC processes. What I haven't heard of yet is successful FPIC processes where indigenous peoples and proponents, both sides, were happy with the results. So, I would be interested to know if some of the audience knows about some of these activities or such examples.
So the next question is, are safeguards meant just for IPLCs?
No. I think it's just that I am working primarily with indigenous peoples and local communities, but safeguards are really meant to address concerns and issues of specific groups. So safeguards, there should also be safeguards for women and youth. And if the communities themselves, or if the affected areas is mostly populated by such, and there is a strong presence of youth, then I think there should also be specific safeguards for them.
Our next question is, do you have specific thoughts about the FPIC guidelines that have come out from UN REDD? You mentioned that the World Bank's use of consultation versus consent could be an issue. Are there or have there been issues with UN REDD FPIC guidelines?
So far, the UN REDD guidelines are well, they look good. It came out from a process of regional consultations, and I always think that, you know, the more consultations, the more participatory a process is, then the better the product is. Like, for instance, the REDD SES guidelines, they're also good. So I don't have any critique on the UN REDD guidelines on FPIC. I would still like to see how it is actually implemented, because, for instance, the way it was implemented in Vietnam, there are concerns with that, and so sometimes they might be good on paper, but the implementation is where we need to test it.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that just about wraps it up for questions. Oh, there's another one that just came through. The next question is, how would you articulate the institutional safeguards with the national laws on consultation / FPIC?
Right. I think that with the developments on FPIC and indigenous people's rights, I would like to believe that the national laws are I hope, will move towards recognizing more and more indigenous people's rights, including the right to FPIC. I think at the moment some countries might have laws on consultations, but they don't have laws on FPIC. And I think it's necessary to move beyond consultation to actually recognizing the right of communities to consent or deny consent to some of the activities. So national laws and consultations are good, especially if they're being done correctly, but I think there's a need to lobby for FPIC to be legislated also at the national level.
Thank you. So feel free to submit some more questions, but while we're thinking, I would like to draw your attention to a few additional WWF REDD resources. The archive of this session will be up in the next day or so at this URL. You can also watch previous learning sessions and learn more about our upcoming learning sessions. I also encourage you to sign up for our REDD Resource Digest, which is a free weekly email roundup of REDD news and information from around the world. Canopy is our free quarterly e-newsletter. That's another great resource for people interested in REDD work, so please register for that as well. And the last 2 points here are some additional REDD resources if you'd like to learn more about our work. And finally, please stay connected with us. You can follow us on Twitter, you can visit our website, and if you have any questions for us or for Minnie, please feel free to reach out using this email address and we will get those answered. Thank you again for joining us today. I hope you found this informative. Thanks to Minnie, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.